Welcome to the Shroud of Turin. I am Adam Otterbein. I became interested in the Shroud in 1938 as a result of studies by my professor, Father Edward Winchell. In 1951, we established the Holy Shroud Guild, and in 1957, we took a group of 40 American scientists over to Turin to study the Shroud for a period of 5 days. The Shroud of Turin is a large piece of linen cloth which is preserved today in the city of Turin. According to tradition, this is the actual cloth in which the body of Christ was wrapped at the time of the burial. But how did the burial cloth of Christ come to the city of Turin in Italy? According to history, the Shroud has been in Turin since 1578. Since that time, it was photographed for the first time in 1898, and again in 1931, and in 1978. The Shroud has been in Turin for 400 years. Prior to that, it was in France. We can trace it back, and we know that there was a fire in France in 1532, which damaged the cloth. The marks of the damage are still visible on the cloth today. The Shroud was in France 100 years before that, where it came into possession of the House of Savoy in 1453. And almost 100 years prior to that, there is a record of the first public exposition of the Shroud in France in 1357. Prior to that, we have a record of Robert Clary, who, as a member of the Fourth Crusade, went to Constantinople. And there he saw a cloth which was said to be the actual burial cloth of Christ. The Shroud disappeared from Constantinople and very probably was brought back with many other things from Constantinople after the Crusaders sacked Constantinople shortly after 1201. But where was this cloth prior to 1201? We have some references to a burial cloth earlier than that. But since the study of the scientists in 1978, historians have been checking to find records of some indication of this cloth prior to that time. Especially Dr. Alan Wanger at Duke University has been developing a method by which he could compare some of the early paintings and works of art with the image on the Shroud. Here we have a picture of the Pantocrator, an icon from the monastery of St. Catherine's on Mount Sinai, which dates back to the 6th century. Dr. Wanger has been able to superimpose the Shroud image on this painting. Here we see the Shroud with markings which help him to superimpose the two images accurately. And by a comparison, this again is the Pantocrator icon, and here we have the two superimposed images. Here, Dr. Wanger has pointed out over 200 marks of congruence, of agreement, marks which could not be merely by chance. He is certain that the artist who painted the icon, the Pantocrator, knew of and saw the actual image that is on the Shroud today in Turin. This is a coin which dates back to the year 692. And again, here it's about the size of an American nickel. Dr. Wanger has superimposed this, the Shroud image on this coin, and again pointed out points of congruence. He has here about 145 points of congruence. Again, too many to be merely coincidence. This is the superimposed image of the Shroud on the coin of 692. So Dr. Wanger is convinced that the artist who made the icon and who made the coin was very familiar with the image which today is on the Shroud in Turin. This is Max Frey, who was the head of the Swiss police department. And he was called to Turin to verify the authenticity of photographs taken in 1969. He asked permission while there to apply sticky tapes to the surface of the shroud in order to pick up some material on the surface of the shroud. He went back to Zurich and there studied what was on his sticky tapes. One of his hobbies was pollen. He used pollen in his police work to place people on the scene of a crime. On the tapes that he picked off the shroud, he found various pollens. This is one of the pollens. The pollen for each plant is very specific. And by means of the pollen, he is able to identify the plants. We have another picture of a different type of pollen. The total number of pollen that Max found on the shroud was about 58. And of the 58, about 17 are from plants which grow in France and Italy in Western Europe. But he also found pollen which grows on plants that grow in the area of Constantinople, and about 20 plants that grow in the area of Jerusalem. So that Max Fry was convinced that this cloth, which is preserved today in Turin, at some time during its existence was exposed to the air in Jerusalem, Constantinople, and in Western Europe. So this is an important piece of evidence. This is a map to show how the shroud probably came from Jerusalem to Constantinople, and then probably by the Crusaders taken over to France, and eventually coming to Turin in 1578. This is a large picture of the entire shroud. It is a piece of linen 14 feet 3 inches long and about 3 feet 7 inches wide. The long dark lines running parallel the entire length of the cloth are scorch marks dating back to the fire in 1532. The image, those are patches, triangular white patches, which the nuns sewed onto the cloth after the fire in 1532. The box that it was kept in was a silver box, and some of the melted silver fell on the cloth and burned the one area, the one corner of the cloth. And the nuns sewed on the patches and also a backing cloth. That is a water stain, which also dates back to the time of the fire. The image between the two dark lines, the image of the back of the body, the shoulders, the legs, and the feet down at the bottom. The image on the other half of the picture was folded over. It covered the front of the body. You have the face, the chest area, the face here, the long hair, the trickle of blood on the forehead, the nose, the eyes, the mustache and the beard, the chest area, the wound in the side, then the arms with the hands crossed, and finally the legs and a blood stain down by the feet. So this is the entire cloth. This is the painting, show how the cloth was used. The body was laid on the right-hand side of the cloth, and then the left half was folded over on top to cover the body. The burial of Christ was a hasty, temporary burial. Christ died about 3 o'clock. 6 o'clock marked sunset, the beginning of the great Sabbath, so there was no time for a very complete or ritual burial of Christ. This, on the left-hand side, is the frontal image as it appears on the shroud. You have the face, the long hair, the trickle of blood on the forehead, the eyebrows, the nose, the mustache, and the beard. The chest area with a wound in the side, the arms with the hands crossed, the wound in the wrist, and then the stain, the blood stain down by the feet. On the right-hand side, we have the image as it appeared on the photographic plate in the camera of Secondo Pia in 1898 when he photographed the cloth for the first time. Here, the highlights and shadows are reversed. They are in their normal or natural relationship. And the fact that this was a positive image on the plate in the camera relationship, and the fact that this was a positive image on the plate in the camera caused quite a bit of concern and interest. Questions, how was this image formed? The only explanation for the fact of the image on the photographic plate being positive was that the image on the cloth itself was a negative image. And then the question was, what was the origin of this negative image which existed several hundred years before we knew anything about photography? Where did it come from? Who could have thought even of a negative image so long before photography? This is the face on the left as it appears on the cloth, and on the right as it appeared on the photographic in the camera. The image on the right is much more natural. It is the normal relationship of highlights and shadows, and gives us a very accurate representation of the man of the shroud. In about 1972, two Air Force officers, John Jackson and Eric Jumper, became interested. They were receiving pictures back from outer space, and by means of the VP8 image analyzer, creating three-dimensional pictures of the moon and the planets. They asked for a picture of the shroud in order to study it with a new complicated technical equipment. And when they scanned the picture of the shroud, they were amazed to discover a three-dimensional image. This was very unusual, to get a three-dimensional image from a black and white photograph of a flat piece of linen cloth. They scanned every 1/5000th square inch of the photograph, recorded it on magnetic tape, and then fed it through the VP8 image analyzer, which reconstructed the three-dimensional image, which you can see especially in the face area. The three-dimensional image was then studied and created a lot of interest among the scientists in the 1970s. The two officers tried to get explanation or help in solving the origin of this image. This is John Jackson standing and Eric Jumper sitting down at the table. They were the ones who really initiated the scientific investigation in the 1970s. They contacted a lot of other scientists at Sandia and many other laboratories, and got their help. They encouraged us to have a meeting of the scientists in March of 1977, and then in September, at this meeting, the scientists proposed various tests and so on in an attempt to find a solution. In September of 77, we took this group of scientists over to Turin, introduced them to the officials over there, and asked permission to do a series of tests after the public exposition, which was to be held in the summer of 1978. The permission was finally given in April of 78. That's John Jackson. The other in the center there is Eric Jumper. So that's Father Rinaldi, our vice president, who has been very active. He was raised in Turin and has been very interested in the shroud ever since he's been a young boy. So the scientists organized then in June of 1978 the Shroud of Turin Research Project, and in October and late September, we took the group of 40 scientists over to Italy. They took about 7 or 8 tons of very sophisticated equipment with them. Here's the truck which is used to pick up the equipment at the airport, bring it to the former Royal Palace, which is adjacent to the chapel where the shroud is preserved, and they set up a temporary lab there. Here you see the large table in the background, which was made here in America for the special testing. The cloth was held attached to the table by means of magnets so as not to damage the cloth. And here we have a picture of the cloth itself. This is very good to give you an idea of how faint the image is. You can also see the scorch marks, which here rather than look like scorch marks, rather than the very dark areas which are visible on the black and white photograph. This is the image of the face, the long hair with the blood stains in the hair and on the forehead. and then the eyebrows, the nose, the mustache, and the beard. But the image is those are the scorch marks. The image is very faint. In fact, it doesn't penetrate the threads. It is only 1/5000th of an inch thick. It is strictly